before the pyramids, before the first royal names were carved into stone, the Nile could become a landscape of thunder. Rain falling far to the south gathered in the Ethiopian highlands and across equatorial Africa, then moved north through a valley far less controlled than the one later Egyptians would know. Water spread beyond familiar banks, channels shifted, islands disappeared beneath brown currents. Walls of mud and reed could be softened, broken, and carried away. The river that would one day nourish the pharaohs arrived as an immense natural force, bringing fertile silt but also uncertainty. The most dramatic evidence for this unruly world does not come from a temple inscription or a tale of a rescued family. It comes from layers of sediment carried beyond the Nile's mouth and deposited beneath the Mediterranean. Those layers preserve a period roughly 9200 to 8600 years ago, when the river repeatedly swung between unusually powerful and much weaker floods. During parts of this interval, the amount of sediment discharged by the Nile may have been 2 or 3 times greater than in later periods. The pattern does not reveal one deluge that erased everything in a single night. It reveals something stranger and perhaps more exhausting generations living beside a river whose behavior could change violently again and again. Imagine approaching the valley during one of those extreme seasons. The river is broader than memory says it should be. Trees, animal tracks, fishing places, and patches of usable ground vanish underwater. Yet beyond the valley, the Sahara is not the endless desert familiar today. Summer rains reach across North Africa, grasslands spread between lakes and wetlands, herd animals move through regions now occupied by dunes, and human communities find water in places that will later become among the driest on Earth. For a time, the safer choice may be to move outward into this greener world. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The mystery begins not with an impossible machine or a forbidden chamber, but with the unstable geography beneath one of history's most famous civilizations. Egypt appears eternal because stone monuments endure. Its older landscapes do not. Rivers erase their banks, mud brick returns to earth, and each flood lays a new surface over the last. The silence before the pharaohs is partly the silence of evidence buried deeply, washed away, or hidden beneath later farms and towns. There were people in and around this changing landscape, but calling them citizens of a single lost civilization would place a modern fantasy over a more complex past. They lived in different communities, used different environments, and adapted over thousands of years. Some hunted, fished, gathered plants, or managed animals. Some moved with seasons and water. Their traces survive unevenly: stone tools, hearths, animal remains, burials, later pottery, and the altered ground itself. What survives in the record suggests persistence rather than one clean beginning. Long before dynastic Egypt, people were learning where water gathered, when grazing returned, which routes remained open, and how quickly a generous landscape could change. The forces behind the great floods were larger than the Nile Valley. During the African Humid Period, the monsoon reached farther north, while distant climatic systems influenced rainfall. Interactions involving monsoon strength, ocean atmosphere patterns, and shorter oscillations could push the river from abundance toward danger and back again. Scholars still debate how particular communities responded, because evidence from the floodplain is incomplete and difficult to date. Extreme flooding may have encouraged some groups to spend more time in the wet Sahara, but no single migration explains the era. Movement was probably repeated, local and reversible. shaped by practical decisions rather than one legendary exodus. This distinction matters because flood stories exert a powerful pull. Once a civilization famous for sacred waters and buried monuments enters the picture, separate clues can become a tale of catastrophe and concealment. Real extreme flooding becomes a universal deluge. Missing settlements become a vanished empire. Layers of silt become evidence of deliberate burial. Divine rulers in much later texts become kings from an impossibly remote age. Together, these steps carry the story beyond what archaeology can support. Ancient Egypt does preserve profound ideas about water. In its creation traditions, ordered land rises from the limitless primeval waters called Nun. In a much later funerary spell, creation is imagined eventually returning to that watery state. Another story describes humanity facing divine destruction, but the liquid spread across the fields is red-coloured beer used to halt the violence, not a flood sent to drown the world. Egypt has no direct equivalent of Noah's Ark or the Mesopotamian survivor Utnapishtim. Its sacred waters belong mainly to cosmology, renewal, and the fragile boundary between order and chaos. They cannot be read as eyewitness testimony from the early Holocene. Yet myth need not be a literal report to carry the texture of a landscape. People who watch dry ground emerge from inundation each year did not need a global disaster to imagine creation as the first mound rising from water. Communities among shifting channels and temporary islands could understand stability as precious and provisional. At Karnak, much later. A sacred complex developed on ground that geological research suggests had once formed an island or elevated patch between river channels. Researchers cautiously propose that such geography may have resonated with the image of the primeval mound. It is compelling, but not proof that one place generated the myth, or that the myth records one flood. The older story is therefore not about a perfect civilization swept away and hidden by jealous kings. It is about repeated environmental pressure, incomplete survival, and human adaptation before Egypt possessed the institutions that made it recognizable. The Nile's violence may have scattered people when the Sahara was green. The Sahara's long drying would eventually help draw communities back toward dependable water. Between those movements lies a deep prehistory in which knowledge accumulated without monuments and societies changed without announcing themselves in royal inscriptions. When the first pharaohs finally emerge, they do not step into an empty valley after a forgotten world has vanished. They inherit a landscape already studied by countless generations, routes between river and desert, techniques for using plants and animals, memories of high and failed water, ritual places, regional identities, and networks of exchange. Much of that inheritance lies beneath later Egypt like a foundation no king designed. To find it, the story must move farther back than dynasties, into a time when the desert carried lakes, the river refused its later boundaries, and Egypt existed only as a possibility waiting within the water. If a great flood once destroyed a civilization before the pharaohs, then somewhere in Egypt's immense surviving literature we might expect to meet its survivor. We might expect a divinely warned ruler, a vessel built against rising water, animals or seeds preserved inside it, and a new human beginning after the river withdrew. That expectation feels reasonable because Egypt grew beside the Nile, and because flood narratives appear in several ancient cultures. Yet when Egyptian texts are examined carefully, the anticipated story never arrives. There is no Egyptian Noah waiting beneath a different name, no confirmed account of one family escaping a universal deluge. and no surviving inscription describing an advanced kingdom erased by a single prehistoric flood. This absence can be difficult to accept because Egyptian religion is filled with water. Temples were associated with sacred lakes. Priests purified themselves before ritual. The Nile's arrival renewed fields, restored agricultural possibility, and helped sustain the cosmic order Egyptians called Mut. Creation itself emerged from a limitless watery state. But water appearing everywhere in a religious tradition does not mean every story involving water belongs to the same family as the flood narratives of Mesopotamia or the Hebrew Bible. Similar images can answer very different questions. One Egyptian composition most often transformed into a flood story is the Book of the Heavenly Cow. Its surviving versions were placed in several New Kingdom royal tombs, although the tradition behind it may be older. The story begins not with rainfall or an overflowing river, but with rebellion. Humanity conspires against the aging sun god Ra. After consulting the divine assembly, Ra sends his fiery eye, embodied as Hathor and then as the violent Sekhmet, to punish the rebels. The goddess attacks with such ferocity that human destruction threatens to continue beyond the god's intention. Ra stops the slaughter through deception. Vast quantities of beer are prepared, coloured red, and poured across the land. Sekhmet sees the liquid gleaming like blood, drinks it, becomes intoxicated, and abandons the killing. From a distance, a field covered with red beer can resemble a flood. Modern summaries sometimes seize that image and call the episode Egypt's deluge tradition, but the differences are fundamental. The liquid is not destructive water. It is the means of salvation. No ark is built. No righteous household is selected. Humanity is not drowned, and the world is not repopulated by survivors after the waters subside. The narrative is instead concerned with rebellion, divine violence, the limits of punishment, and the withdrawal of the Creator from direct life on earth. After the crisis, Ra rises into the sky upon the heavenly cow. The ordered relationship among humans, gods, and the cosmos is permanently changed. It is a story about separation and the dangerous fragility of divine kingship, not a disguised report of a Holocene catastrophe. Another text seems closer to a watery ending. In spell 175 of the Book of the Dead, Atum imagines a remote future when the ordered world will cease and everything will return to none. The primeval waters from which creation emerged, Atum and Osiris alone will remain in transformed states. The imagery is immense and unsettling land, temples, kingdoms, and all familiar distinctions eventually dissolve into the formless condition that preceded them. Yet this is not a memory of something that happened before the first dynasty. It is a theological vision of time's ultimate completion. Egyptian thought could imagine creation as cyclical, vulnerable, and dependent upon the continued maintenance of order. To say that the world may one day return to none is no more a historical flood report than a modern prophecy of the end of the world is an eyewitness description of an ancient disaster. The text looks forward into sacred eternity, not backward toward a drowned civilization. The famous famine stela offers another 7-year disaster, but here the problem is too little water. The inscription tells how Egypt suffered because the Nile failed to rise adequately during the reign of Djoser. Fields dried, food became scarce, and society entered distress. Djoser sought knowledge of the river's divine source and honoured Khnum, the god associated with the Nile's origins near Elephantine. Prosperity could return when the relationship between ruler, god, land, and temple was restored. The stela was created more than 2,000 years after Joseph's lifetime, probably during the Ptolemaic age. It cannot be treated as a contemporary report from the Old Kingdom. Its ancient setting gave authority to later religious and territorial claims. Even so, its choice of disaster is revealing. In Egypt, a failed inundation could be as terrifying as an excessive one. The river's ideal behavior occupied a narrow space between absence and destruction. Too low, and grain failed. Too high, and houses, boundaries, animals, and stored supplies could disappear. Royal records make this practical anxiety visible. Fragments collectively associated with the Palermo stone preserve portions of early royal annals. Alongside reigns, ceremonies, and royal events appear measurements of Nile flood heights. These observations turned the river into administrative knowledge. A flood could influence harvest expectations, taxation, labour, and the security of the kingdom. The entries are not a poetic memory of one overwhelming deluge. They reveal the repeated attention of a state that needed to watch the river year after year. The same annalistic tradition includes rulers placed before the better documented dynasties. While the much later Turin king list reaches even farther into sacred time by positioning gods and spirit-like predecessors before human kings. To modern eyes, these sequences can look like records of rulers who governed tens of thousands of years ago. But Egyptian king lists were not neutral chronological databases. They organized the past according to religious and political ideas. Gods ruled first because kingship itself was imagined as divine before it became a human office. Mythic duration established cosmic legitimacy. It did not provide an archaeological date for a forgotten empire. There may have been oral stories of local floods that disappeared without being written, and the surviving corpus represents only part of what Egyptians once told. Papyrus decays. Temples were dismantled, traditions changed across regions and millennia. Absence of evidence cannot prove that no Egyptian community ever told a tale about escaping unusually high water, but possibility must not be converted into a recovered national epic. No known text allows us to reconstruct an Egyptian original behind Noah, Utnapishtim, or the Greek Deucalion. Mesopotamian flood traditions arose within their own literary and environmental worlds. Biblical authors reshaped inherited Near Eastern themes for different theological purposes. Greek writers developed their own cycles of destruction and survival. Much later, travelers, occult writers, and modern popular media placed Egypt at the center of a universal lost civilization narrative, because its monuments seemed old enough to contain every secret. Stories that were separate in antiquity gradually became fused in modern imagination. Egypt's genuine relationship with water is more subtle. The river did not divide history into a perfect age before the flood and a fallen world afterward. It returned annually, never in exactly the same way, carrying both renewal and risk. Sacred order was not achieved once and secured forever. It had to be restored repeatedly, just as fields reappeared after inundation and the sun returned after night. To understand how Egyptians transformed that experience into cosmology, we must leave the search for an ark behind and approach a quieter image, a dark, limitless expanse of water, and the first patch of earth slowly rising into light. Before a field could be planted, its surface had to return. For weeks, water might cover the floodplain, softening boundaries and turning familiar paths into channels. Then the current slowed, pools withdrew, dark sediment emerged beneath the sun, and small elevations appeared first, like islands in a temporary sea. To anyone living through this rhythm, creation was not an event belonging only to an unimaginably remote beginning. In a quieter form, creation happened repeatedly. Ordered ground rose from water, life returned to mud, and the habitable world had to be recovered once more. This landscape helps explain why primeval water occupies such a deep place in Egyptian thought, but it does not reduce Egyptian religion to a simple observation of the Nile. The Egyptians developed several traditions about the beginning of existence, shaped by different cities, priesthoods, and historical periods. These traditions overlapped, competed, and were combined. There was no single authorized creation story that remained unchanged across 3,000 years, just as there was no single Egyptian explanation for every god, temple, or sacred landscape. The element most traditions shared was not a destructive flood. It was an original condition without ordinary distinctions. Before land, sky, human beings, or kingship, there was none limitless, dark, inert water. None was not merely an ocean surrounding the world. It represented the absence of the structured relationships that made existence possible. Nothing had yet been separated. There was no stable ground on which life could stand and no established course for the sun to follow. In the tradition associated with Heliopolis, the creator Atum emerged from this state, sometimes as imagined as appearing upon the first mound of earth. From Atum came Shu and Tefnut, followed by Geb and Nut, and then the divine generations through which the organized cosmos took shape. Later imagery connected the first emergence with the Benben, the primordial elevation associated with the solar cult. The exact details varied, but the movement was always from undifferentiated potential toward distinction, water and land, earth and sky, darkness and light, stillness and life. At Hermopolis, creation was expressed through a group of 8 primordial deities arranged in male and female pairs. They embodied qualities such as darkness, hiddenness, limitless water, and formlessness. Their interaction preceded the first appearance of light or the first rise of solid ground. In the Memphite tradition, Ptah created through thought and authoritative speech, conceiving the world in the heart and bringing it into being through the tongue. At Elephantine, Khnum could be imagined forming living bodies like a potter shaping clay. These were not competing scientific theories. They were sacred ways of describing how order, identity, and life emerge from a condition in which none of those things yet existed. Because Egyptian temples were repeatedly rebuilt, enlarged, and reinterpreted, their physical locations could become part of this cosmic language. A sanctuary was not simply a building placed on convenient ground. Its elevated core might be understood as the first land rising from Nun. Its surrounding walls separated ordered sacred space from the dangerous formlessness beyond. Its inner rooms grew darker and more restricted as one approached the divine presence. Processions, offerings, purification, and spoken ritual continually renewed the relationship between gods, king, people, and cosmos. At Karnak, this religious symbolism may have possessed an unusually tangible geographical foundation. Recent reconstruction of the ancient landscape, using dozens of sediment cores from the temple area and wider region, suggests that the earliest occupation developed on an elevated patch or island between branches of the Nile. Before the ground became stable and extensive enough, prolonged settlement may have been difficult. Over centuries, river movement, sediment deposition, and human construction changed the island into part of a larger inhabited surface. It is tempting to imagine the first residents watching their island emerge and inventing the primeval mound at that moment. The evidence cannot take us that far. Geological resemblance does not establish the origin of a myth, and the earliest recoverable religious texts are much later than the first human encounters with the location. Yet the relationship remains meaningful. A temple associated with creation stood upon ground that had literally risen and expanded within a watery landscape. Myth and geography did not need to preserve the same event to reinforce one another. Similar processes occurred throughout the valley. The Nile did not occupy one permanent channel. It divided, migrated, abandoned branches, cut into older deposits, and laid down new ones. Habitable islands appeared and merged with the floodplain. Other areas were eroded or buried. A village that once stood beside flowing water could later find itself far from the main river. A landing place could become a field. A settlement mound could be covered by later occupation, agricultural soil, or meters of river sediment. This shifting ground creates one of the central illusions surrounding Egypt's remote past. Monumental stone remains visible, while ordinary landscapes disappear. A pyramid may survive above the desert for 45 centuries, but a settlement of reeds and mud brick can dissolve into soil within generations. Later builders reuse elevated locations. Farmers level ancient mounds. Irrigation cuts through old layers. Modern towns spread across places where prehistoric communities once cooked, repaired tools, buried relatives, and watched the river. When archaeology finds only scattered traces beneath such landscapes, absence can appear deliberate. It can seem as though someone removed an earlier civilization. But rivers are capable of concealment without conspiracy. So are wind, salt, groundwater, cultivation, construction, and time. The pharaohs did build over older sacred places and incorporated earlier traditions into royal ideology. But this was not the same as discovering an advanced prehistoric empire and burying it. Most of what disappeared required no coordinated destroyer. It was vulnerable from the moment it was made. The primeval mound therefore offers a more accurate key to Egypt's beginnings than the image of an ark. The mound does not preserve a survivor from one universal catastrophe. It expresses the continual achievement of stable life within instability. Land rises, order is established, and the forces of dissolution remain beyond its edges. The Egyptians later gave this process divine names and monumental form, but its emotional foundation may have been understood long before writing dry ground was never trivial. Predictable water was never guaranteed, and permanence had to be created. Far from the temples that would later formalize these ideas, communities were already responding to a much larger transformation. The green spaces beyond the Nile were beginning to lose their water. Lakes contracted, grasslands retreated, routes that had supported animals and people became harder to cross. As the Sahara slowly dried, the valley's narrow bands of dependable water grew more important. Human groups did not arrive all at once, carrying the blueprint of Egypt. They gathered, separated, exchanged knowledge, and adapted across generations. Out of those movements came not one forgotten civilization, but the many cultures from which pharaonic Egypt would eventually emerge. The drying did not announce itself as a single disaster. No one could stand beside a Saharan lake and watch an entire climate vanish in one lifetime. The change unfolded unevenly, interrupted by wetter intervals and shaped differently from one region to another. A shoreline retreated a little farther, a seasonal pool failed to return. Grass grew thinner along a familiar route. Herds moved toward water earlier than expected. What appeared temporary to one generation became the normal condition inherited by the next. During the African Humid Period, large parts of the Sahara supported grasslands, wetlands, lakes, and human communities. Rock art preserves cattle, wild animals, boats, hunters, and social scenes in landscapes that now seem impossible. Archaeological sites reveal hearths, pottery, fishing equipment, animal bones, and burials scattered across areas presently dominated by stone and sand. These people were not members of one Green Sahara civilization. They belonged to many communities separated by distance, ecology, language, custom, and time. What united them was dependence upon a world of water that would not endure. The transformation was not caused by one failed rainy season. Slow changes in Earth's orbit altered the distribution of solar energy and weakened the monsoon's northern reach. Vegetation declined as rainfall became less reliable, and the loss of vegetation could intensify drying by changing how the land reflected heat and recycled moisture. Lakes contracted at different rates. Some regions remained usable long after others became difficult. Human responses were therefore varied. Communities moved, divided, stayed near shrinking water sources, changed subsistence strategies, or found new seasonal routes. The Sahara's drying is sometimes presented as the moment when its entire population marched eastward and founded Egypt. That simple migration story is attractive because it gives one cause, one movement, and one beginning. The evidence suggests a much more complicated process. People had inhabited the Nile Valley and its neighboring deserts long before the final stages of the humid period. Connections between the valley, the western desert, Nubia, the Red Sea region, and the Levant developed repeatedly. Population movement probably occurred in many directions over centuries rather than as one organized exodus. Even so, the environmental pressure was real. As dependable water disappeared from broad Saharan regions, the Nile and its associated lakes, marshes, and seasonal basins became increasingly important. The valley offered permanence, but not comfort without effort. Its narrow, habitable corridor could be crowded. High floods threatened settlements, while low floods endangered food. Marshes supported fish, birds, and useful plants, but also concealed predators and disease. Agricultural land had to be understood locally, and the river's timing could never be controlled completely. Some groups continued to move between desert and valley environments. Others established longer-lived settlements where water, grazing, fishing, and cultivable soil met. Knowledge carried by mobile communities may have included techniques for managing livestock, finding hidden water, processing wild plants, making pottery, and traveling across landscapes that later became impassable. Yet no single group arrived carrying the complete package of Egyptian civilization: farming, animal management, craft specialization, ritual authority, and political organization developed through interaction, experiment, borrowing, and local adaptation. Ancient DNA adds another fragment to this story. Although it cannot provide the missing master key, two individuals buried around 7,000 years ago at Taqqara in what is now Libya belonged largely to a deeply rooted North African lineage. Their genomes contained only limited ancestry related to populations of the Levant, even though livestock and pastoral practices had already entered North Africa. This suggests that ideas, animals, and techniques could spread without farmers simply replacing everyone who lived there. But Taqqara lies far west of the Nile, and 2 individuals cannot represent the population of the entire Green Sahara. They do not identify a mysterious people who later became the Egyptians, nor do they reveal the ethnicity of pyramid builders thousands of years afterward. Their importance is subtler. They show that prehistoric North Africa contained long-standing local populations, and that cultural change did not always require mass migration. People could meet, exchange animals or knowledge, and still preserve much of their regional ancestry. The same caution applies when looking toward the Nile. Human remains from prehistoric Egypt are unevenly preserved, and the valley's heat, floods, groundwater, later construction, and intensive agriculture have destroyed or concealed much of the record. Each burial or genome represents a person, not an entire civilization. The temptation to use a small sample to assign a single racial identity to ancient Egypt reflects modern arguments more than prehistoric reality. The communities forming along the Nile were connected to Africa first of all, while also participating in wider networks extending northeast and south. What archaeology can reveal more clearly is increasing diversity and permanence. In the Fayum region, communities used the lake and surrounding lands for fishing, hunting, gathering, farming, and animal keeping. Storage pits indicate the importance of preserving grain, but they do not prove the existence of a centralized state. At Merimde in the western delta, generations built dwellings, made pottery, kept animals, cultivated crops, and buried their dead within or near inhabited space. These were organized communities, yet they were not miniature versions of dynastic Egypt waiting for crowns and pyramids. Farther south, the Badarian tradition displayed another combination of practices: fine pottery, personal ornaments, stone tools, agriculture, herding, and carefully prepared burials reveal communities in which identity and social difference were becoming more visible. Grave goods suggest that some individuals possessed objects or status unavailable to others, but the evidence does not show a unified kingdom ruling the entire Nile Valley. Regional traditions developed at different speeds and expressed authority in different ways. In the north, communities associated with Maadi and Bhutto maintained strong connections with the Levant and participated in exchange networks carrying materials, animals, technologies, and styles. In Upper Egypt, Naqada communities expanded their influence through trade, competition, alliance, and perhaps violence. Hierakonpolis became an especially important center, with large-scale production, ritual spaces, elite burials, and evidence for the controlled display of animals. These developments occurred before the fully formed pharaonic state, but they already contained many of the social forces from which that state would emerge. None of these places alone was the lost civilization before Egypt. Together, they reveal something more historically significant. Egypt had many beginnings: delta farmers, desert pastoralists, river fishers, craftspeople, traders, ritual specialists, and ambitious local leaders all contributed to a changing social world. Their communities sometimes cooperated and sometimes competed. Traditions were absorbed, reshaped, or displaced. By the time royal authority united much of the valley, thousands of years of accumulated knowledge had already prepared the ground. The drying Sahara did not create Egypt by itself. Neither did an invading people, a drowned empire, or knowledge inherited from divine rulers. Environmental change narrowed choices and redirected movement, but human decisions determined what followed. Families selected places to settle. Herding routes became exchange routes. Storage created new forms of wealth and vulnerability. Burials made status visible. Ritual gatherings brought scattered populations together, while competition allowed certain centers to grow at the expense of others. Gradually, the valley became more than a refuge from expanding desert. It became a corridor in which people, objects, symbols, and ambitions moved with unusual intensity. Regional worlds began to overlap. Pottery styles traveled. Valuable stones and metals crossed long distances. Elite graves became larger. Images of boats, captives, animals, and powerful figures appeared on objects and rock surfaces. Long before the first royal dynasty, the language of authority was beginning to take shape, and with it, the possibility that one region's version of the past would someday overshadow all the others. If one region's version of the past eventually overshadowed all the others, the Nile Delta was especially vulnerable to disappearance. Its northern landscape offered water, fish, birds, grazing, fertile soil, and access to the Mediterranean. But it was a poor archive. The river divided into shifting branches before reaching the sea. Floods deposited new layers of silt. Channels migrated across older settlements. Groundwater rose into buried remains, while later farmers, towns, canals, and cities repeatedly occupied the same desirable locations. Where Upper Egypt preserved cemeteries along dry desert margins, much of Lower Egypt's early history sank beneath wet earth. This difference in preservation has shaped the story told about Egypt's origins. The south produced spectacular objects from elite graves, decorated pottery, carved knife handles, ceremonial palettes, ivory labels, and images of powerful figures defeating enemies. Such discoveries seem to lead directly toward dynastic kingship. In the north, settlements were more likely to be buried, waterlogged, dispersed, or hidden beneath modern occupation. A culture known through damaged houses and undecorated tools can appear less complex than one known through richly furnished tombs, even when the comparison reflects the survival of evidence rather than the ability of the people themselves. The result is a historical illusion. Egypt's unification can look like a complete civilization moving north from Upper Egypt and entering a passive delta. Older narratives sometimes treated southern Naqada culture as the sole engine of state formation, absorbing or replacing communities that contributed little of their own. Archaeology now presents a more entangled landscape. Northern communities had long histories of farming, animal management, fishing, storage, craft production, exchange, and settlement. They were transformed during the rise of the state, but they were not empty ground awaiting civilization. To the southwest of the delta, the Fayum Depression preserves traces of communities using the shores and changing resources of an ancient lake. People hunted, fished, gathered plants, cultivated cereals, kept animals, and moved through a landscape whose water level shifted over time. Pits containing grain have often been presented as evidence for permanent farming villages, but the interpretation is not simple. Some sites may have been occupied seasonally or repeatedly rather than continuously. Storage did not automatically require a king, a bureaucracy, or even a densely built settlement. It could belong to households and mobile groups planning for future returns. That uncertainty is important. The earlier steps toward agriculture did not create cities overnight. People could combine cultivated grain with fishing, hunting, and gathering for many generations. They could manage animals while still moving between different environments. The boundary between farmer and forager was often less rigid than later historical categories suggest. Egypt did not begin when one population abandoned an older way of life and adopted a complete new system. It emerged through long periods in which different practices coexisted and were adjusted to local conditions. At Merimde Beni Salama, on the western edge of the delta, the evidence reveals a more substantial and long-lived settlement tradition. Across generations, inhabitants built dwellings, prepared food, made pottery and stone tools, cultivated plants, managed livestock, and buried many of their dead within the inhabited area. The settlement changed over time, and its houses were not miniature versions of later Egyptian towns. Yet Merimde demonstrates that sizable communities had developed in Lower Egypt long before dynastic rule. Its dead were not placed in the elaborate desert cemeteries that later made southern elites so visible. Many burials were modest, with bodies positioned in pits close to everyday living space and few grave goods. If social value was measured only by objects placed in tombs, Merimde might seem poor or politically unimportant. But burial custom is not a direct scale of social complexity. A community may express identity through houses, ancestry, food sharing, ritual performance, or access to land rather than through spectacular possessions sealed with the dead. Farther east and later in time, Maadi became part of a wide network connecting the Nile Valley with Sinai and the southern Levant. Its inhabitants lived near routes through which copper, stone, pottery, livestock, and other materials could move. Some architectural forms and objects reveal contact with communities beyond Egypt. These connections have sometimes been turned into a story of foreign founders arriving with the knowledge required to create Egyptian civilization. The evidence supports exchange and mobility, not the replacement of Egyptian development by an outside master population. At Maadi, local and imported traditions existed together. People could adopt a vessel form, building technique, raw material, or method of working copper without surrendering their identity. Traders might travel while most inhabitants remained local. Families could form across regional boundaries. Objects could pass through several hands before reaching the settlement. Similarity does not always mean migration, and migration does not always mean conquest. The community belonged both to the Nile world and to a network extending northeast, illustrating how Egypt's early development was connected without being externally invented. Buto, deeper in the delta, has become especially important because its stratified remains preserve part of the transition between northern traditions and the expanding influence of Naqada culture from the south. Layers at the site contain changes in pottery, craft practices, and patterns of contact. Earlier scholarship sometimes treated these changes as straightforward proof that southern newcomers conquered or replaced the northern population. More cautious interpretations consider a range of possibilities: migration, intermarriage, imitation, elite competition, trade, local adoption, and gradual political incorporation. The surviving material cannot provide a complete diary of what happened. A new pottery style may indicate new people, but it can also indicate changing taste, technology, or economic relationships. The appearance of southern administrative practices may reflect political control, yet the people using them could include local families adapting to a new order. State formation rarely leaves a clean line between conqueror and conquered. Its reality is made of alliances, coercion, marriages, exchanges, rivalries, and decisions whose details vanish while the resulting institutions endure. Lower Egypt may also have supported important centers now deeply buried beneath later landscapes. Suez, for example, became a major city in historical periods, but accessing its earliest levels is difficult because thousands of years of occupation accumulated above them. Other settlements may lie beneath fields, modern towns, or sediments associated with vanished river branches. Archaeologists cannot excavate what they cannot safely reach or identify. A blank space on a map of prehistoric sites, therefore, does not necessarily represent an empty region. This is one sense in which the pharaohs inherited and buried an older world. Dynastic communities built temples, residences, workshops, harbours, walls, and administrative centres upon landscapes already used for generations. Canals redirected water, fields were cultivated repeatedly, mud brick structures collapsed, were levelled, and became foundations for later construction. Royal authority reorganized settlements and concentrated activity in places useful to the state. None of this required a secret command to erase the past. Ordinary continuity was enough to conceal it. The other burial occurred in memory. Dynastic kingship presented Egypt's existence as an ordered sequence centered upon rulers. Royal monuments celebrated the king who united, protected, nourished, or restored the two lands. Local histories survived unevenly within temple traditions and regional identities, but the state's public image favored a single sacred country. Communities that had once followed separate paths became predecessors inside a story whose conclusion seemed inevitable. Their independence faded because later Egyptians remembered the land through the institution that had successfully united it. That memory was powerful, but it was not complete. Beneath it stood the northern farmers, fishers, herders, craftspeople, and traders whose contributions rarely entered royal inscriptions. Their settlements show that the delta had its own histories before unification, even if water and later construction made those histories difficult to recover. The rise of Egypt was not simply the triumph of civilization over emptiness, it was the joining, absorption, and sometimes suppression of many existing worlds. In the south, however, ambition was becoming increasingly visible. Settlements grew around production and exchange. Elite cemeteries separated powerful families from ordinary households. Exotic animals, valuable materials, ritual boats, and specialized crafts became instruments through which leaders displayed command over people and nature. At places such as Saqqara and Hierakonpolis, authority was no longer merely present within a community. It was beginning to perform itself, and that performance would eventually produce the figure Egypt remembered as the pharaoh. At Hierakonpolis, power learned how to become visible, long before a ruler could claim both banks of the Nile as one kingdom. Leaders in this upper Egyptian center were assembling many of the elements later associated with pharaonic authority. They gathered people for ceremonies, controlled specialized production, obtained rare materials, organized large burials, and surrounded themselves with images of boats, animals, captives, and command. The pharaoh did not suddenly appear at the beginning of the first dynasty. His role was constructed gradually from older forms of leadership whose names have almost entirely vanished. Hierakonpolis stood near routes linking the river with the eastern desert and lands farther south. Its position helped residents reach stone, minerals, animals, and exchange networks beyond the cultivated valley. During its greatest prehistoric expansion, the settlement included domestic areas, workshops, cemeteries, ceremonial spaces, and zones devoted to producing food and goods on a scale larger than the needs of a single household. Archaeologists have uncovered kilns, breweries, pottery production, and evidence of skilled craftspeople whose work may have been organized by emerging elites. Beer was more than an everyday drink. Made from grain, it provided nourishment, could be distributed to workers, and played a part in hospitality, feasting, and ritual. Brewing installations at Hierakonpolis suggest production capable of serving substantial gatherings. A leader who could assemble grain, labor, vessels, fuel, and guests was doing more than offering refreshment. He was demonstrating access to stored resources and the ability to transform them into social obligation. Food consumed together could create loyalty, mark rank, honor the dead, or bring dispersed communities into a shared ceremonial world. One particularly important area, known as HK29A, appears to have contained a large ceremonial complex. Its open space, substantial enclosure, deposits of pottery and animal remains, and repeated rebuilding suggest that people returned for communal events over a considerable period. We cannot recover the words spoken there or identify precisely which gods, ancestors, or leaders were honored. Yet the site reveals organized ritual before temples were built in the monumental forms familiar from dynastic Egypt. Gatherings at such places may have helped turn local authority into something larger. People who normally lived apart could witness the same performances, consume food from the same stores, and observe leaders controlling access to rare objects or powerful animals. Ritual did not merely decorate politics. It created occasions on which hierarchy became believable. A leader's authority could appear to reach beyond the household and beyond ordinary human limits, touching the dangerous forces embodied by the desert, river, ancestors, and wild creatures. That connection becomes especially striking in the elite cemetery known as HK6. Several tombs were associated with enclosures, posts, painted or plastered structures, and burials of animals that included species not normally found together in one place: baboons, wild cattle, elephants, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, leopards, and other animals have been identified in the wider cemetery context. Some showed injuries that had healed, suggesting they had been captured and kept alive for a time before burial. These animals were not evidence of a forgotten prehistoric zoo created for curiosity alone. Capturing them required knowledge, labor, transport, and considerable risk. Their presence around elite burials communicated reach and control. The hippopotamus could destroy crops and threaten boats. The crocodile ruled the water's edge. The elephant embodied a scale of power beyond any human body. To possess such animals, even temporarily, allowed an elite household to display mastery over environments and dangers that ordinary people could not command. The symbolism anticipated a central theme of later kingship. The pharaoh was repeatedly shown imposing order upon forces represented as wild, foreign, rebellious, or chaotic. Yet the animals at HK6 also reveal the cost behind that image. Some had endured confinement and injury. Human authority was being expressed through the capture, movement, and ritual death of living beings. The sacred appearance of control rested upon material systems of labor and coercion. Human inequality was also becoming harder to hide. While many people were buried modestly, certain graves demanded unusual quantities of wood, craft work, animal life, and organized effort. Valuable objects traveled long distances before entering tombs. Specialized artisans produced goods that were removed permanently from circulation when buried with powerful individuals. Death became an opportunity to preserve status, and elite cemeteries turned social differences into durable landscapes. At Saqqara, Abydos, and other centers, comparable changes unfolded in distinct local forms. Larger graves appeared. Exotic materials became concentrated. Symbols of authority circulated over greater distances. Painted pottery and rock imagery showed boats carrying figures, standards, and equipment along river and desert routes. Boats connected communities physically, but they also became moving stages upon which power could be displayed. A procession arriving by river made authority visible long before writing could explain who commanded it. No single object proves that these communities were already kingdoms. A large tomb does not automatically identify a king, and a figure standing above others may represent ritual importance rather than formal government. Archaeologists reconstruct political transformation from patterns: the increasing concentration of wealth, the growth of specialized production, the spread of shared symbols, the enlargement of ceremonial centers, and the ability of some groups to mobilize labor beyond the household. Competition among centers probably accelerated that transformation. Exchange could bring prosperity, but it also created routes worth controlling: productive land, access to desert resources, livestock, stored grain, and skilled craftspeople could all become sources of conflict. Alliances joined families and communities, while raids or warfare removed rivals. The surviving images emphasize victorious leaders and defeated enemies, but they cannot tell us how often authority depended upon negotiation, marriage, gifts, or local cooperation rather than open violence. Over time, the visual language of leadership became more standardized. Powerful figures appeared at a larger scale than those around them. Animals symbolized controlled strength. Standards represented communities or divine powers. Bound captives embodied defeated opposition. Scenes of hunting and combat merged the abilities of warrior, ritual specialist, and ruler. These conventions would later make the king recognizable even when his name was absent. This was not yet the timeless Egypt imagined by later temples. It was a changing field of regional powers, each with its own ancestors, ritual places, economic interests, and claims to importance. Some centers would rise, others would decline or be absorbed. Their leaders may have possessed titles and histories now lost forever. When one royal tradition eventually dominated, it inherited symbols that many communities had helped create and presented them as natural attributes of a single sacred office. The pharaohs therefore buried an older world partly by succeeding it. They transformed local ceremonies into state ritual, regional symbols into royal emblems, and networks of exchange into systems of taxation and administration. What had developed collectively across generations came to appear as the possession of the crown. At the threshold of recorded history, that crown was moving toward one ruler whose surviving images would make unification look like a single decisive victory, even though the creation of Egypt had taken thousands of years. The victory survives on stone, but the war does not. Around 3100 BCE, a king named Nahma appeared in images so powerful that later generations would treat him as standing at the doorway of Egyptian history. On one side of a ceremonial pallet, he raises a mace above a kneeling captive. On the other, he advances beneath the red crown associated with Lower Egypt, inspecting the aftermath of conquest. The object seems to offer exactly what a simple origin story requires: one ruler, one enemy, one decisive moment, and one country born through victory. Yet the Nahma palette is not a battlefield report. It does not identify a date, describe a military campaign, or explain how long political consolidation took. It was a ceremonial object, probably deposited in a sacred setting at Hierakonpolis. Its images communicate royal power through symbols already developing for generations. The king is not shown as an ordinary man participating in a confused human struggle. He is made larger than everyone around him, calm amid violence, and capable of imposing order upon captives, cities, animals, and the land itself. Narmer's name appears at the top within a royal frame called a serech. A catfish and a chisel provide the signs conventionally read as Narmer. On one face, he wears the tall white crown associated with Upper Egypt. He grips a captive by the hair while preparing to strike. Above the prisoner, the falcon Horus controls a human head emerging from papyrus plants, imagery often connected with domination over a northern marshland or defeated territory. Behind the king, a much smaller attendant carries his sandals, emphasizing that the event possesses ritual as well as military meaning. On the opposite face, Narmer wears the red crown associated with Lower Egypt. Standards move before him in procession, while defeated bodies lie arranged ahead. Below, two fantastical long-necked creatures are restrained by human handlers, their curved necks forming the circular depression inherited from functional cosmetic palettes. At the bottom, a bull smashes through a fortified enclosure and tramples an enemy. The bull is not merely an animal, it is the force of kingship made visible, breaking resistance while remaining beyond ordinary human strength. Because Narmer wears both crowns on the same object, the palette has often been described as a record of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. That interpretation remains possible, but it is not the only one. The scenes could commemorate a particular victory, express a repeated royal ritual, claim authority that still had to be enforced, or present an ideal image of domination rather than a literal sequence of events. The entwined creatures have been interpreted as the joining of the two lands, but their exact meaning is uncertain. Their presence cannot, by itself, prove that two previously independent kingdoms were united on a particular day. The palette tells us what Narmer wanted power to look like. It does not tell us every step by which that power was achieved. Long before his reign, southern material culture, elite customs, symbols, and exchange networks had already spread northward. Communities in the delta were adopting, modifying, or being compelled to use practices associated with emerging Upper Egyptian authority. Earlier rulers had placed their names upon objects and sent goods across considerable distances. Political consolidation was already underway before Narmer appeared. Violence was probably part of that process. Predynastic imagery contains bound captives, combat, fortified places, and leaders striking enemies. Valuable land, river routes, storage, livestock, workshops, and access to imported materials gave communities reasons to compete. Some centers declined as others expanded. Human remains occasionally preserve injuries, while destroyed or reorganized settlements may reflect conflict. But archaeology does not reveal one continuous campaign moving neatly from south to north. Warfare existed beside alliance, marriage, trade, ritual exchange, migration, and negotiated submission. Other ceremonial objects from Hierakonpolis complicate the picture further. A mace head associated with a ruler conventionally called scorpion shows a king holding a hoe near a canal or irrigation feature. Standards and attendants surround him, and the scene may represent the ceremonial opening of a channel or another act of royal authority over water and land. The object does not prove that one king invented irrigation. It shows that managing the productive landscape had become part of the ruler's public identity. The king's strength was therefore not expressed only by killing enemies. He appeared as the person who could make land useful, gather offerings, organize labor, communicate with divine powers, and transform regional resources into royal abundance. The same office that destroyed disorder claimed to produce fertility. This combination would remain central to Egyptian kingship. The ruler smote enemies at the boundaries of the ordered world and presented offerings inside its temples. Violence and nourishment became two sides of the same sacred responsibility. The Narmer macehead may depict another royal gathering, perhaps involving tribute, captives, offerings, or a ceremonial appearance of the king. The surviving signs and figures have generated several interpretations, none completely secure. What matters is the scale of organization represented. Animals, goods, officials, standards, and large numbers of people are drawn into a visual field centered upon one seated ruler. Regional wealth is no longer shown simply moving between communities. It flows toward the crown. Narmer's name has been found beyond Hierakonpolis and Abydos, including in northern contexts, indicating that his reach was not confined to a small Upper Egyptian center. Yet possession of objects bearing a royal name does not reveal the exact character of rule. Some places may have been directly administered. Others may have paid tribute, accepted royal representatives, or participated in trade under unequal conditions. A kingdom can appear unified in ceremonial imagery, while remaining varied and difficult to govern on the ground. Later, Egyptian tradition remembered a founder called Menes as the first human king of a united Egypt. For generations, scholars attempted to identify Menes directly with Narmer. Others connected the name with Narmer's probable successor, or interpreted it as a later title or compressed memory rather than the personal name of one securely identified ruler. The evidence does not resolve the question completely. Narmer was clearly a foundational figure, but the later story of Menes may combine several stages of consolidation into one ancestral king. That compression was politically useful. A country created through countless local negotiations and conflicts is difficult to celebrate. A country created by one victorious ruler is easy to imagine. It provides a beginning, a legitimate succession, and a model for every later king who claims to restore unity after disorder. The complexity of the past narrows into a royal line. Communities become territories. Regional gods become protectors of the crown. Independent leaders disappear into the category of defeated enemies or anonymous predecessors. Even after Narmer unification was not permanently complete, early kings continued to travel, build, collect resources, establish institutions, and demonstrate authority in both north and south. Rebellion or regional resistance remained possible. The royal court required administrators who could count produce, identify estates, seal containers, dispatch officials, and organize labor. A symbolic claim to the two lands had to become a practical system capable of moving information and resources through an extremely long river valley. The creation of that system changed what could survive in memory. Writing was increasingly used to name kings, institutions, commodities, places, and officials. Seal impressions marked controlled goods. Labels attached events and deliveries to particular reigns. Tombs at Abydos preserved the names of rulers whose authority reached far beyond their burial place. The state began constructing an archive, but it recorded the world from the viewpoint of the institutions creating it. This was another way the older civilization became buried. The many communities that had built Egypt's agricultural, ritual, and technological foundations did not vanish physically at the moment of unification. Their descendants continued to farm, fish, herd, brew, weave, build, and transport goods. But their separate histories were absorbed into a political order that named the king far more often than the people supporting him. Narmer's palette did not erase them deliberately. Its brilliance simply made the ruler visible while leaving almost everyone else in shadow. When later Egyptians looked backward, the shadow deepened. The first dynasty became a line of kings. Before it stood divine rulers, spirits, and uncertain names. Behind them stretched an age without written voices, easily transformed into myth. To understand what the pharaohs truly buried, we must now follow the first labels, seals, annals, and king lists, not because they preserve the whole past, but because they reveal how the state learned to select which past deserved to be remembered. Writing changes the shape of silence, but it does not end it. When the first Egyptian rulers began attaching signs to jars, boxes, bolts of cloth, and other controlled goods, they were not opening a complete window onto the world before the pharaohs. They were creating a new instrument of authority. Names could travel farther than voices, deliveries could be identified, estates distinguished, and royal possession marked across distance. Yet the same system that made the king increasingly visible left most communities almost as anonymous as before. Some of the earliest evidence comes from Tomb Uj at Abydos, built several generations before Nama for an elite ruler often called Scorpion Niast. Although that identification remains uncertain, the tomb contained imported vessels, large quantities of goods, and small bone or ivory labels incised with signs. Some may identify places, institutions, commodities, or quantities. Scholars continue to debate whether every sign represents fully developed writing, or whether part of the system remained closer to pictorial notation. Either way, the labels reveal administration operating across a network wide enough to require durable identification. This beginning is easily misunderstood. Writing was not invented so that ordinary people could describe their lives or record an objective national history. Its earliest surviving uses are bound to storage, exchange, ritual, burial, and elite control. A sign attached to a container might preserve the identity of an estate, while revealing nothing about the farmers who produced its contents. A royal name might survive for 5,000 years while the names of everyone who harvested, transported, sealed, and buried the offering disappeared. During the first dynasty, writing became more recognizable and more widely integrated into government. Sereks displayed royal names. Seal impressions linked goods and rooms to kings or officials. Labels combined names with images of ceremonies, places, offerings, or defeated enemies. These small objects can look like fragments of historical narrative, but their meanings are often difficult to reconstruct. A scene may refer to an actual event, an institution, a ritual performance, or a formula repeated in honor of the ruler. The earliest archive speaks in compressed signs, created for people who already understood the context. What it preserved was selective by design. The state needed to know where grain came from, which workshop supplied a product, which official held responsibility, and which king authorized an activity. It did not need to preserve the independent history of every village absorbed during unification. Once local produce entered a royal storehouse, its place of origin became part of an administrative geography. Once a regional sanctuary received the king's patronage, its traditions could be expressed as elements within the order he maintained. Diversity continued, but it was increasingly described in the language of the state. Centuries later, royal annals organized the past more formally. The fragments commonly grouped around the Palermo stone list rulers, ceremonies, cult activities, constructions, and measurements of Nile inundation. The entries divide reigns into named years, making royal time appear orderly and continuous. Yet even these annals are not a complete chronicle. Their surviving fragments are damaged. Their original arrangement is partly reconstructed, and the terse entries rarely explain the human conflicts behind an event. A kingdom's difficult formation becomes a sequence of reigns and ritual acts. The top register appears to preserve rulers before the conventional First Dynasty, including figures associated with Lower Egypt. This is valuable evidence that later compilers recognized royal predecessors, but it does not give us a clear history of a lost northern kingdom. Names without narratives cannot reveal the size of their territories, the nature of their authority, or whether every figure ruled in the same political sense. The annals remembered that someone came before. They did not restore the worlds those people governed. New Kingdom king lists shaped memory even more visibly. At Abydos, Seti's arm and the future Rameses II were shown honouring a long sequence of earlier kings. The list linked the reigning dynasty to an authorized chain reaching back to the beginning of human kingship. It was a sacred genealogy, not a neutral register. Rulers considered disruptive, illegitimate, or unsuitable for the intended ritual sequence could be omitted. Hatshepsut was absent. So were Akhenaten and several rulers associated with the Amarna succession. The foreign Hyksos dynasties were excluded from this idealized ancestry. Other lists preserved different selections. The Saqqara list did not match Abydos in every detail. The Turin king canon, written on papyrus, included reign lengths and extended the sequence into divine and semi-divine time, but it survives in many damaged fragments. Its arrangement shows that Egyptian scholars possess traditions broader than a single temple list. Their disagreements also warn us that there was never one perfectly preserved master record hidden behind every surviving version. For later interpreters, the reigns of gods and followers of Horus can sound like evidence for an advanced civilization tens of thousands of years before Narmer. Within Egyptian sacred history, however, divine rule explained the origin and legitimacy of kingship. Mythic predecessors placed human government inside cosmic order. They were not accompanied by settlements, material cultures, or contemporary inscriptions from those impossible spans. Converting sacred duration into literal archaeological chronology creates the vanished civilization the evidence is supposed to prove. The deeper truth is less spectacular and more revealing. The Egyptian state did not invent the past from nothing, but it arranged inherited memories around the crown. Some rulers were preserved, others were excluded. Local traditions survived when temples continued to perform them, while many communities left no text at all. Even the act of writing created shadows around whatever administrators did not consider worth naming. This was not necessarily a conspiracy. Every archive is shaped by purpose, survival, and power. Papyrus decays, monuments are recarved, and political restoration encourages rulers to emphasize some ancestors over others, but the result can resemble deliberate erasure when viewed from thousands of years away. The pharaohs buried the older world not beneath one secret monument, but beneath an official sequence in which history began to look like the history of kings. At Abydos, that sequence was anchored in actual graves. Early rulers were buried in the desert at el-Kab, surrounded by goods, symbols, and in some cases the bodies of retainers whose deaths helped create royal eternity. There, administration, ritual, memory, and violence met in the same ground. To understand the human price of turning many pasts into one royal history, we must leave the king lists on temple walls and descend toward the tombs where Egypt's first dynasty made authority permanent. The bodies formed part of the architecture. Around the royal tombs at el-Ka'ab, archaeologists found rows of smaller graves arranged beside chambers built for Egypt's earliest dynastic rulers. Similar burials appeared around immense mud-brick funerary enclosures closer to the cultivated land. Men and women, officials and attendants, artisans and other members of the royal household were placed in carefully ordered positions, as though the court itself had been extended beyond death. Here, the new state did not merely record hierarchy, it constructed hierarchy beneath the ground. The practice began on a significant scale during the reign of Aha, one of Nama's immediate successors. His tomb was accompanied by subsidiary graves, while additional burials surrounded his funerary enclosure. The people interred there were not necessarily anonymous slaves seized from distant communities. Surviving goods and burial arrangements suggest that some possessed wealth, skill, office, or proximity to the court. They may have included administrators, craftspeople, guards, servants, and individuals whose identities were tied closely to the king's household. This makes the evidence more disturbing, not less. If these people held honoured positions, their closeness to the ruler may have created both privilege and mortal obligation. Service to the king did not necessarily end when the king stopped breathing. A court organized around a sacred ruler could imagine death as a transfer rather than a release. The royal household required food, protection, ceremony, craft, transport, and administration in eternity, just as it had required them on earth. The clearest evidence for sacrifice does not come from a weapon mark preserved on every skeleton. Many graves were robbed, disturbed, poorly preserved, or excavated before modern archaeological methods developed. Instead, the argument depends heavily upon construction. Around the funerary enclosure of Aha's successor, Jer, adjacent graves and their wooden roofing appear to have been completed as one coordinated operation. At Aha's enclosure, separate graves were sealed beneath a continuous floor laid soon after construction. The bodies could not have accumulated naturally across many years and then been placed together with equal freshness. The arrangement indicates that numerous people were buried at essentially the same moment. It remains difficult to reconstruct exactly how they died. Strangulation, poisoning, cutting, or another controlled method has been proposed in different discussions, but the surviving physical evidence does not justify one universal scene. The process may also have changed between reigns or between groups of retainers. Archaeology supports coordinated death and burial far more securely than it reveals the final minutes of the individuals involved. Under Jer, the practice reached an extraordinary scale. His royal tomb at Abydos was surrounded by more than 300 subsidiary graves. While many additional burials accompanied his funerary enclosure, the dead included both men and women, and the differences among their graves suggest multiple ranks and occupations. This was not a pile of bodies left after battle. It was a planned mortuary population, organized so that human identity became part of the king's eternal establishment. The logistical demands were immense. Graves had to be dug and lined. Wood had to be obtained in a land where suitable timber was valuable. Coffins, pottery, food, jewelry, tools, seals, and other objects were prepared. Officials had to coordinate the funeral, while labourers completed the tomb and enclosure according to a sequence that allowed all the subsidiary burials to be closed together. Human sacrifice was therefore not an uncontrolled outburst of grief. It was administration applied to death. The practice reveals how rapidly royal power had expanded. Only generations earlier, leaders at Hierakonpolis displayed dangerous animals and rare goods around elite burials. Now the king could command not only the labour of living subjects, but the deaths of people within his own institutional world. The ruler's passage into eternity became an event capable of stopping many other lives at once. Political unification had given sacred kingship a new scale, and the cemetery recorded that scale in human bodies. Yet we should not imagine the victims as a single powerless category. Some may have been coerced openly. Others may have lived within a belief system in which accompanying the king promised honour, continued status, or privileged existence beyond death. Families might have interpreted selection as both loss and elevation. Court ideology could transform compulsion into sacred duty. None of these possibilities makes the deaths voluntary in a modern sense, and none can be demonstrated for every burial. They show why labels such as servant, sacrifice, noble, or slave cannot capture the complete social reality. The graves also expose the contradiction inside royal eternity. The king was presented as the protector of order and the source of life, yet his death could require the destruction of members of the community he ruled. Egyptian kingship resolved that tension symbolically by treating the ruler as more than an individual. His continued existence helped sustain the cosmos, the gods, the Nile's fertility, and the unity of the two lands. If the king's survival preserved universal order, then human lives devoted to his afterlife could be presented as necessary rather than wasteful. Behind this theological solution stood fear. A royal death created uncertainty. Succession could invite rivalry, regional resistance, or conflict within the court. Funeral ceremony, therefore, had political work to perform among the living. It displayed the resources controlled by the new ruler, demonstrated continuity with his predecessor, gathered officials into a shared ritual, and removed people whose identity may have belonged most strongly to the former reign. We cannot prove that subsidiary burial served as political elimination, but the possibility reminds us that eternity and succession were never completely separate. The tomb itself was only one part of the royal landscape. At el-Kab, the body rested in the desert cemetery used by powerful predecessors. Farther toward the settlement, a monumental enclosure provided a setting for offerings and ceremonies. Some enclosures appear to have been deliberately filled, dismantled, or ritually buried after a limited period of use. Their disappearance was not necessarily destruction by enemies. The transfer of the building into the king's eternal realm may have been part of its intended life. Nearby boat graves expanded that realm still further. Full-sized wooden vessels were buried in long brick-lined structures near an early royal enclosure at Abydos. Their precise owner and ritual function remain debated, but the boats demonstrate the ability of the court to assemble timber, skilled construction, and organized labor for objects that would never sail in ordinary traffic again. A king who had moved through Egypt by river in life required the idea of movement after death through sacred landscape, celestial waters, or the routes connecting royal power with the gods. People, boats, food, vessels, furniture, and imported materials were withdrawn from the living economy and concentrated around one dead ruler. This was conspicuous consumption made permanent. The royal funeral announced that the crown possessed resources in such abundance that it could place them beyond human reuse. Even robbery could not erase the original statement. Empty chambers and broken graves still reveal how much had once been gathered there. The mass subsidiary burials declined during the First Dynasty. Later rulers continued to build elaborate tombs and surround death with labor and wealth, but the organized killing of large retinues did not remain a defining practice of Egyptian kingship. The reason is uncertain. It may have become socially dangerous, economically costly, ritually unnecessary, or incompatible with changing ideas about service after death. Symbolic representations, models, images, and eventually servant figurines would perform some duties once imagined through actual human presence, although that development was gradual rather than a single direct replacement. What endured was the principle behind the graves. The royal afterlife was a state project. Thousands of people could quarry, transport, craft, calculate, cultivate, guard, and offer without being killed at the funeral. The institution learned to preserve the king eternally while keeping most of its workforce alive. That transformation made royal mortuary building more sustainable and allowed it to grow to scales the first dynasty could scarcely have imagined. The retainers at Abydos therefore stand at a severe threshold. They belong to the moment when sacred leadership became territorial government, when service became administration, and when the ruler's death reorganized both landscape and society. Their names are mostly gone, but their graves contradict the polished image of unification preserved on palettes and king lists. Egypt's first royal order was not created only with symbols, grain, boats, and writing. It was also created through bodies placed in the ground. As the practice faded, the ambition did not. Royal tombs became more architecturally complex. Mud brick, timber, stone, storage chambers, enclosure walls, and ritual routes were assembled into increasingly controlled environments. Then, during the reign of Djoser, stone would transform the royal grave into something visible from far across the landscape. The pharaoh would no longer take an entire living court into death. Instead, the state would turn the labor of generations into a mountain. Stone did not make the king eternal by itself. It made his claim harder to ignore. At Saqqara, during the reign of Djoser in the early 3rd dynasty, royal burial architecture rose above the desert in a form unlike anything previously completed on that scale. The step pyramid began close to the shape of an enlarged mastaba, the low rectangular monument already associated with elite tombs. Through repeated expansion, it became a 6-tiered structure visible from far beyond its enclosure. The state had learned to turn a grave into a landmark and a ruler into part of the horizon. Later tradition connected this achievement with Imhotep, eventually remembered as a sage and healing god. Contemporary evidence is more restrained. His name and high titles appear on the base of a statue of Djoser found within the complex, an unusual honor demonstrating his proximity to the king. He may have directed the project, but no surviving construction journal allows us to assign every decision to one brilliant architect. Like Egypt itself, the monument emerged from accumulated knowledge organized through a powerful institution. Its builders did not begin without precedent. Craftspeople had long cut stone vessels, lined chambers, shaped mud brick, worked timber, measured land, and constructed elite tombs. Royal enclosures at Abydos had separated sacred space from ordinary landscape, while mastabas at Saqqara combined burial chambers with storage and places for offerings. Djoser's complex gathered these traditions and translated temporary materials into limestone. That translation can still be read in the architecture. Stone blocks were shaped to resemble wooden beams, reed matting, rolled screens, and bundles of plant material. Doorways and facades copied forms that had developed in mud brick, timber, and woven vegetation. The first great stone complex was therefore not a clean rejection of the older world. It was an attempt to preserve that world permanently. Materials that normally cracked, burned, rotted, or dissolved were imitated in stone so that the king's ideal environment would not decay. The enclosure covered an immense ceremonial landscape. A high limestone wall surrounded courts, shrines, passages, facades, and buildings not designed as ordinary rooms. Most apparent doorways were false, while controlled access led visitors through an entrance passage lined with stone columns. Architecture staged a royal world of appearance, offering territorial symbolism and renewed kingship. The Hebsed court is central to this interpretation. The said festival renewed the ruler's strength and affirmed his ability to govern. Chapels and boundary markers created an eternal setting for such performances. Many buildings were too solid or restricted to function normally. They instead gave the dead king the permanent possibility of performing rituals upon which renewed authority depended. This helps explain why the complex should not be understood simply as an extravagant container for a corpse. The pyramid marked the burial, but the surrounding architecture maintained the office. Djoser could continue appearing as ruler, receiving ritual service, moving through sacred space, and renewing his command over the two lands. The monument transformed kingship into a landscape that remained active after the human body had disappeared. Beneath the pyramid, permanence took a different form. A deep shaft and a maze of corridors, chambers, and magazines extended through the bedrock. Blue-green faience tiles resembled reed matting, giving underground rooms the appearance of an eternally fresh palace. Relief panels showed Djoser performing ritual actions. Far below the stone mass, he occupied an idealized environment of movement, vegetation, palace space, and renewal. The substructure also contained an astonishing quantity of stone vessels and fragments. Traditionally estimated in the tens of thousands, they were made from alabaster, breccia, diorite, rock crystal, and other materials whose acquisition and shaping represented generations of skilled labor. Some carried names or inscriptions associated with rulers and officials of earlier dynasties. In a literal sense, Djoser's builders placed pieces of Egypt's royal past beneath the new monument. Why they did so remains debated. The vessels may have been heirlooms, offerings, objects recovered from earlier tombs, or material establishing continuity with predecessor kings. Their damaged and crowded condition complicates any single explanation. They do not resemble an archive of technology salvaged from a civilization destroyed by a flood. There are no machines, unknown metals, encoded maps of a drowned continent, or texts describing survivors who taught Egyptians how to build. The objects belong to the development visible in early dynastic Egypt royal names, elite workshops, long-distance procurement, stoneworking skill, ritual reuse, and institutions capable of collecting enormous quantities of valuable goods. Their presence is remarkable because it demonstrates memory and accumulation, not because it breaks the archaeological sequence. The galleries reveal another meaning of burial. To place older objects beneath Djoser's pyramid was not necessarily to erase them. Burial could protect, dedicate, transform, or remove an object from ordinary circulation. An item hidden from human view might become more fully available to the dead and the gods. Modern observers often assume that visibility creates significance, but Egyptian ritual could make concealment powerful. Sealed chambers, foundation deposits, and grave goods performed their purpose precisely because living crowds could no longer reach them. Even the pyramid's successive enlargements have sometimes encouraged misleading fantasies. Because one construction phase enclosed another, the monument can appear to contain the remains of a still older structure. It does, but the inner stages belong to the documented evolution of Djoser's own project. beginning with a mastaba-like form and expanding through revised plans. Architectural growth is not evidence that a pharaoh discovered a prehistoric pyramid and covered it with his own. The masonry shows experimentation by builders learning how a very large stone monument behaved under its own weight. That experimentation required failures, corrections, surveying, supply systems, and sustained labor. Limestone had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and placed. Food had to support workers. Tools had to be produced and repaired. Officials recorded resources, while teams coordinated tasks whose results depended upon one another. The step pyramid represents not a sudden gift of impossible knowledge, but a threshold reached when craft traditions met a state capable of concentrating them. The human cost cannot be measured only through sacrificed bodies. Unlike the First Dynasty retainer graves, Djoser's monument drew strength from living labor organized over years. Some workers served seasonally, others were specialized craftspeople attached to royal institutions. Obligation, rationing, devotion, ambition, and compulsion could coexist. Service to the crown was at once economic, political, and sacred. From the desert edge, the completed monument changed how power occupied space. Earlier royal tombs had been grand, but much of their architecture remained low or hidden. Djoser's pyramid rose above its enclosure like a staircase or an artificial mountain, though the exact meanings assigned to its form remain uncertain. It announced that the king's order could be made larger than any household, more durable than mud brick, and visible across generations. Yet stone created its own distortion. Because Djoser's complex survived, everything before it can appear primitive. The villages, camps, breweries, workshops, cemeteries, shrines, and regional centers that produced its knowledge mostly vanished or remained difficult to see. The pyramid did not conceal one advanced civilization beneath Egypt. Its scale concealed the many developments without which it could never have existed. After Djoser, kings and builders continued to experiment. Some pyramids cracked, changed angle, or were abandoned. Construction methods evolved through trial rather than following a perfect plan inherited from remote antiquity. In the Fourth Dynasty, the successful forms at Merimde, Dahshur, and Giza would make royal stone architecture seem timeless, but the monuments themselves preserve the opposite lesson. Their masonry records a history of change, and inside that change lies the strongest evidence against the fantasy of a finished civilization appearing before the pharaohs. Sneferu inherited a staircase and pursued a perfect slope. During his long Fourth Dynasty reign, royal builders moved between Merimde and Dahshur, raising pyramids whose surviving masonry preserves changes of plan, structural anxieties, and solutions tested at extraordinary scale. Later observers would see the smooth-sided pyramid as a complete idea, almost too exact to possess a history. Sneferu's monuments return that history to view. They show that the form associated with Giza was not recovered from a vanished age. It was learned in stone, one difficult decision at a time. At Merimde, a tall, ruined core rises above a vast ring of debris. Its appearance has inspired descriptions of a tower emerging from the remains of a collapsed mountain. The monument began as a step pyramid and was enlarged through successive stages before builders attempted to convert it into a smooth-sided pyramid. The earliest phase is sometimes attributed to Huni, the last king of the Third Dynasty, but firm contemporary evidence connecting him with Merimde is lacking. Sneferu is securely associated with the monument, and the final transformation belongs to the architectural program of his reign. The conversion required builders to fill the steps and place an outer mantle around the existing core. This was not merely a cosmetic layer. A true pyramid demanded a continuous slope, stable packing, carefully laid casing, and an understanding of how different masses of masonry would settle against one another. For generations, the ruin was presented as the result of a sudden collapse during construction, a royal disaster so severe that the builders fled north to begin again. The evidence remains less obedient than that story. Scholars still debate when and how the outer portions failed. Structural weaknesses may have developed where later masonry rested around the stepped core, but quarrying in later periods also removed casing and support. Mortuary activity continued at Merimde, and the monument was not necessarily abandoned after one catastrophic fall. Its present condition records both ancient engineering and centuries of dismantling. Even so, Merimde revealed problems that mattered. Enlarging a step pyramid into a true pyramid placed enormous weight upon connections never intended for the final form. A smooth face could conceal discontinuities inside the mass, but it could not make them disappear. The builders learned that visual perfection depended upon hidden structure. What later appears effortless at Giza had to be supported by decisions about foundation, angle, bonding, sequence, and the relationship between core and casing. South of Saqqara, in the open desert at Dahshur, Sneferu's next great monument makes correction visible across its entire profile. The bent pyramid rises steeply from the ground, then changes angle roughly halfway upward and continues with a gentler slope. Most interpretations connect this change with problems encountered during construction, although the precise causes remain uncertain. The lower courses rose at an angle of about 54 degrees, imposing great pressure upon the masonry and chambers below. Cracks and signs of movement appeared within the structure. Builders used timber beams in an attempt to brace parts of the interior, and they modified the way upper masonry was laid. The change to a shallower angle reduced the weight required to complete the pyramid and directed forces more safely downward. Whether fear of a Merimde failure influenced the decision cannot be proven, especially because the chronology of Merimde's damage remains disputed. What the bent pyramid shows directly is a project responding while it was still alive. The correction did not turn the monument into an abandoned experiment. Its casing survives more extensively than that of almost any other Old Kingdom pyramid, preserving the bright geometry later monuments have largely lost. It possessed two entrance systems, descending from the north and west into separate internal arrangements that were later connected: a smaller pyramid, temples, an offering place, a causeway, and associated structures made it part of a complete royal funerary landscape. Sneferu's cult operated there after his death. The changed angle was incorporated into a functioning monument rather than hidden as a disgrace. Not far away, the Red Pyramid offered a more stable answer. Its name comes from the warm colour of the local limestone now exposed after most of the fine outer casing was removed. Built with a shallower angle close to the upper part of the bent pyramid, it spread its mass across a broader base and rose with less structural aggression. 3 corbel vaulted chambers within it demonstrate continued experimentation with interior space, each ceiling formed by courses projecting inward until the gap could be closed high above the floor. The Red Pyramid is commonly described as the first successfully completed large true pyramid. The phrase is useful if treated carefully. Merimde and the bent pyramid were essential stages, not failed sketches erased by the final design. The Red Pyramid succeeded because knowledge gained across those works was carried forward by surveyors, quarry workers, haulers, masons, carpenters, administrators, and planners. Their achievement belonged to an organized community of practice, even though royal memory placed Sneferu's name above it. The scale of his building program remains astonishing. Stone was quarried in quantities that required sustained provisioning and transport. Work areas needed tools, timber, rope, water, grain, and labor. Blocks were moved, prepared, and set according to measurements repeated thousands of times. The ramps and lifting arrangements used at every stage remain debated. No surviving diagram solves the process, but uncertainty about details does not create evidence for vanished machines. It shows how much working knowledge can disappear when it's practiced rather than celebrated in inscriptions. Sneferu's projects also refined the pyramid complex as a system. The royal tomb stood within a network of temples, courts, processional routes, subsidiary structures, storage, offerings, and agricultural estates that supported the cult. A pyramid was never only the visible mass. It depended upon lands producing food, officials directing deliveries, priests maintaining ritual, and communities whose labor connected the desert monument to the living valley. Its smooth face expressed unity because the complicated systems beneath and around it were made invisible. In that sense, the pyramids truly buried a civilization, but not the imagined civilization of flood survivors and unknown technology. Inside their cores they buried abandoned plans, altered angles, earlier construction phases, temporary ramps, filled spaces, and the marks of work. Around them, royal names overshadowed the thousands of accumulated decisions that made royal eternity possible. The monuments concealed their own learning because successful architecture tends to hide the struggle that produced it. By the end of Sneferu's reign, the essential vocabulary of the Great Pyramid had been assembled a stable true slope. Carefully organized chambers, a broader funerary complex, administrative supply, specialized labor, and a state willing to commit immense resources across decades. His successor Khufu did not stand before an impossible problem with no precedent. He inherited Meidum's exposed lessons, the bent pyramid's visible correction, and the red pyramid's controlled mass. North at Giza, those lessons would be concentrated into one plateau and carried to a scale that changed the world's memory of Egypt. The Great Pyramid would later appear so singular that it seemed to demand a singular explanation. Yet behind its clean geometry stood the ruins, revisions, and accumulated skill of monuments already rising in the desert. Giza was not the beginning of the knowledge. It was the moment that knowledge became almost large enough to erase its own history. At Giza, the monument became so large that the civilization behind it almost disappeared. The Great Pyramid presents a surface of abstract geometry, 4 sides, a square base, descending passages, chambers, shafts, and millions of blocks gathered into a single form. Its apparent simplicity encourages the belief that it arrived through one secret method, yet archaeology restores the crowded landscape that the finished pyramid conceals a world of harbours, quarries, bakeries, workshops, boats, scribes, cattle, rope, copper tools, administrative seals, and people working within teams whose names occasionally survive. Khufu inherited more than architectural knowledge from Sneferu. He inherited an expanded state capable of drawing resources from throughout Egypt. Limestone could be quarried locally beside the construction site, while finer casing stone came from Tura across the river. Granite travelled north from Aswan. Timber, copper, grain, livestock, pottery, and textiles entered supply networks extending far beyond the plateau. The pyramid was built at Giza, but its economic footprint reached into villages, estates, quarries, and ports across the country. Much of its core consisted of limestone available directly beneath or near the monument. Quarrying this material locally reduced the distance over which the greatest volume had to move. The plateau itself became both source and building site. Channels, ramps, tracks, work areas, and temporary structures changed as construction advanced. Some traces vanished beneath later masonry, debris, cemeteries, or modern development, leaving no single preserved diagram of the entire operation. This absence is often treated as proof that conventional archaeology has no explanation. In reality, uncertainty concerns the exact combination of methods used at particular stages: sledges, ropes, levers, ramps, prepared surfaces, boats, human teams, and careful sequencing were all technologies available to Egyptian builders. Different block sizes and destinations created different problems. Moving stone across level ground was not the same as placing it high within the rising core. A method suitable for early courses might become inefficient near the summit. The project did not require one magical ramp performing every task from beginning to end. The surviving monument also resists fantasies of machine-like perfection. Measurements are astonishingly accurate at the scale of the whole structure, but individual blocks vary greatly. Many internal core stones were fitted with practical rather than invisible precision, while fine workmanship was concentrated where it mattered most in casing, chambers, passages, and structural transitions. Mortar helped fill irregular spaces, tool marks, altered surfaces, cracks, and construction adjustments remain visible. The builders pursued controlled geometry through stone that was never perfectly uniform. Their organization can be glimpsed through painted and incised marks left in spaces later sealed inside the pyramid. Work crews carried names associated with Khufu, including groups whose identities expressed loyalty to the king. These markings were not messages intended for distant tourists. They belonged to the internal life of construction, identifying teams or faces of labor. Their presence in inaccessible relieving spaces above the king's chamber strongly connects the monument with Khufu's reign and with the human crews who assembled it. Even more direct testimony emerged far from Giza at Wadi el-Jarf on the Red Sea coast. There, archaeologists discovered fragments of papyri dating to the end of Khufu's reign. Part of the archive belonged to a team led by an inspector named Merimde. The documents include accounts of supplies and a logbook recording daily activities. Merimde's crew travelled through waterways, worked around Tura, and transported limestone toward Akhet Khufu, the name of Khufu's pyramid complex. The journal does not explain how every block was lifted or reveal the complete workforce. Its importance lies in its ordinariness. Days are organized around movement, loading, sailing, waiting, reporting, and receiving provisions. The Great Pyramid enters the record not as a relic uncovered by Khufu, but as an active royal construction project supplied by boats and administered by named officials. Merimde does not describe survivors of a flood teaching forbidden engineering. He describes a state-moving stone. Water made this movement possible. The Nile and its connected basins brought heavy cargo closer to the plateau than the modern landscape initially suggests. Ancient channels have shifted, filled, or disappeared, making Giza seem more isolated from river transport than it was during the Fourth Dynasty. Boats carried people, provisions, and building materials through a landscape engineered around seasonal water. The pyramid rose from the desert edge, but it depended upon the river. South of the Sphinx, excavations at Hayt el Ghurab revealed a large planned settlement associated mainly with the pyramid complexes of Khafra and Menkaure, with possible earlier occupation beneath it: streets, galleries, storage spaces, houses, workshops, bakeries, administrative buildings, animal remains, pottery, and seal impressions reconstruct a support system for royal construction. The site should not be assigned mechanically to every phase of Khufu's pyramid, but it demonstrates the kind of urban infrastructure developed at Giza during the 4th dynasty. Its inhabitants were not one uniform mass. Some lived in large houses connected with administration. Others occupied more collective accommodations: skilled craftspeople, officials, labourers, bakers, brewers, herders, sailors, stoneworkers, and guards participated in overlapping institutions. Food remains indicate large-scale provisioning that included grain and substantial quantities of livestock and fish. Feeding the workforce was itself a national project requiring herds, fields, transport, storage, slaughter, preparation, and accounting. The nearby cemetery gives some of these workers individual bodies again. Their bones preserve the stresses of strenuous labour, accidents, healed fractures, and lives shaped by physical work. Tombs varied according to status. Supervisors and skilled individuals could receive more substantial burials, while others were placed in modest graves. They were not buried like disposable foreign captives beneath the pyramid's foundation. Yet this does not mean every worker was free in a modern sense. Corvée obligations, institutional dependence, wages or rations, professional service, religious duty, and coercion could exist together. The old image of endless lines of enslaved people driven by whips survives, partly because it offers a simple moral explanation for overwhelming scale. The opposite image, cheerful volunteers building from pure devotion, is equally misleading. Ancient states mobilized labor through systems that did not divide neatly into freedom and slavery. Rural households may have supplied workers for limited periods. Specialists could serve permanently. Officials managed crews, while the crown transformed taxation and obligation into food, transport, and construction. What unified these people was not one personal motive but one administrative system. A mason might care about skill, rations, family status, royal duty, or advancement. A seasonal labourer might experience service as expected, sacred, exhausting, or compulsory. The monument gathered these different lives into one result and then placed Khufu's name upon it. That is how royal architecture works. Collective effort becomes singular memory. Khufu himself remains strangely difficult to see. Only a few surviving representations can be assigned to him securely, including a famously small ivory figure. The king who commanded the largest pyramid in Egypt did not leave a correspondingly large personal biography. His monument overwhelmed his human identity. Later stories could therefore remake him as tyrant, magician, seeker of secret chambers, or guardian of knowledge inherited from before a catastrophe. But the strongest surviving evidence leads away from a concealed predecessor civilization. It leads toward the cumulative Egypt already visible at Nabta Playa, in delta settlements, at Hierakonpolis, Abydos, Saqqara, Merimde, and Dahshur. Giza concentrated traditions that had developed across generations and connected them through an unusually powerful state. Its wonder does not diminish when lost machines disappear from the story. The achievement becomes more human, more complicated, and in many ways more extraordinary. The Great Pyramid buried chambers, passages, construction marks, tools, mortar, and the labour of teams whose full stories are lost. It also buried the developmental path that made it possible, because the finished monument looked too complete to have evolved. Yet outside its stone mass, journals, settlements, quarries, cemeteries, and abandoned working surfaces return that history piece by piece. A flood did exist behind Egypt's civilization, but not necessarily in the form promised by modern legends. The Nile inundated the land repeatedly. Deserts had once been wetter, lakes expanded and vanished. Communities moved as climates changed, carrying skills and memories into new landscapes. To find the real relationship between water, catastrophe, and Egyptian origins, we must now leave Giza's engineered stone and return to the unstable environments that shaped the stories Egyptians told about the beginning of the world. The flood behind Egypt was not one night. It was a changing relationship between water, land, and people unfolding across thousands of years. The Nile passed through climatic conditions unlike those known to the Pharaohs. Rainfall strengthened across parts of North Africa. Lakes expanded in regions that are now desert. Grasslands reached far beyond the later river valley. Yet abundance did not arrive as a permanent green age. Wet decades alternated with drought. Shorelines advanced and retreated, and communities lived inside a landscape whose reliability could never be assumed. The Nile itself gathered conditions from an enormous basin. Rain over the Ethiopian highlands fed the Blue Nile and Atbara, delivering much of the water and sediment associated with the summer inundation in Egypt. The White Nile connected the river to equatorial lakes and wetlands that stored and released water differently. Changes in one region did not automatically occur in another. A greener Sahara could influence human movement and local drainage without controlling every Egyptian flood. It was a continental system combining monsoon rainfall, distant lakes, seasonal channels, vegetation, erosion, and time. Evidence recovered from sediment beneath the eastern Mediterranean preserves an interval between about 9,200 and 8,600 years ago. Thick layers carried offshore by the Nile suggest repeated episodes of powerful erosion and exceptional sediment transport. The sequence alternates between extremely strong and weak floods more rapidly than later records, revealing instability rather than one continuous deluge. Researchers have proposed that some flood conditions may have made portions of the valley difficult or temporarily impossible to occupy. This is real evidence for extraordinary water, but it does not identify a drowned capital, a vanished dynasty, or a civilization equipped with technology later inherited by Egypt. A marine core records material delivered from across a vast watershed. It cannot name the people who watched the river rise, describe their settlements, or show that every community suffered at the same moment. The interval also lies several thousand years before political unification and the Great Pyramid Age. Converting repeated early Holocene floods into one Egyptian apocalypse compresses centuries of environmental change into a story the sediment does not tell. What the evidence does allow is a more human possibility. Groups living near channels, marshes, and low floodplain surfaces would have moved when water destroyed camps or altered access to food. Others were abandoned when a channel migrated, a lake contracted, or grazing declined. People carried stoneworking traditions, fishing knowledge, herding practices, social ties, and ritual memories between the Sahara, oases, delta, and Nile Valley. Movement did not require a single refugee march after a global disaster. It could occur family by family, generation by generation, as familiar water returned in unfamiliar ways. The end of the African Humid Period was equally uneven. orbital changes gradually weakened the summer monsoon, but regional landscapes crossed ecological thresholds at different times. Vegetation loss exposed soil. Lakes became smaller or more saline. Drought episodes punctuated the long transition. By the later prehistoric period, increasing aridity made dependable water more valuable and concentrated growing populations around the Nile. But the river was not an empty corridor suddenly filled by one displaced civilization. Archaeology instead shows multiple communities participating in that concentration. Pastoral groups, fishers, farmers, craftspeople, and traders did not arrive with identical customs. Their pottery, burial practices, tools, and economies varied by region and changed through contact. Some knowledge may have entered the valley from the western desert or farther south. Other developments occurred within the Delta and Nile Valley. The future Egyptian world formed through convergence, competition, exchange, and adaptation, not through the survival of one complete state whose name was deliberately erased. The Delta makes this history particularly difficult to recover. Its low landscape has been repeatedly reshaped by shifting river branches, flood deposits, subsidence, agriculture, settlement, and rising Mediterranean waters. Early occupation can lie deeply buried beneath alluvium or beneath later towns. Organic materials decay. Mud brick architecture dissolves back into mud, and a site resting near an ancient channel may disappear when the channel moves. Upper Egypt's desert edge cemeteries and settlements are often more visible, creating an archaeological imbalance that can make southern development seem more isolated than it was. This missing northern record matters. Lower Egypt was not merely a passive territory waiting for southern kings to conquer it. Delta communities occupied strategic routes between the Nile, Mediterranean coast, Sinai, and Southwest Asia. They farmed, herded, fished, crafted goods, and participated in exchange long before unification. Sites such as Merimde, Maadi, and Buto preserve different moments in this complicated history, but they represent only fragments of a much larger inhabited landscape. What lies beneath delta sediment is likely to include villages, seasonal camps, fields, workshops, and waterways, not necessarily palaces from an unknown super-civilization, but the ordinary foundations without which Egypt could not emerge. Burial by the river is therefore both literal and misleading. Flood sediment can cover human surfaces and preserve traces beyond sight. It can also erode them completely. Later construction seals some remains while destroying others. When archaeologists drill cores or excavate small windows, they encounter a landscape organized by channels that no longer exist. The absence of monumental ruins does not mean the delta lacked importance. Yet the possibility of undiscovered settlement is not permission to populate every blank space with an advanced lost culture. Unknown evidence remains unknown until it is found. By the time dynastic Egyptians recorded flood heights, the annual inundation had become part of a managed agricultural rhythm. Too little water threatened harvests, too much could damage fields, houses, and boundaries. The ideal flood was neither absence nor catastrophe but controlled renewal, silt, moisture, surveying, basin cultivation, storage, taxation, and labour turned seasonal water into state power. Kings could claim responsibility for abundance even though rain fell far beyond their borders. This recurring emergence of land from water-shaped Egyptian imagination, the dark floodplain appeared after inundation, while islands and mounds rose above the retreating surface. Temples could identify their sacred ground with the first place to emerge from primordial waters. Creation was renewed in miniature whenever order returned from fluid uncertainty. But resemblance is not proof that priests preserved a precise memory of floods thousands of years earlier. Myths can grow from repeated experience, ritual logic, and theological reflection without functioning as encrypted geological reports. The environmental record therefore changes the central mystery. Something truly was buried before the Pharaohs' channels, camps, local histories, and generations of adaptation. Powerful floods truly occurred, and a wetter North Africa truly vanished. But no surviving layer reveals one lost Egyptian civilization swept away and secretly rebuilt by its heirs. To discover how Egyptians themselves imagined the world before kings, we must turn from sediment to language and ask what their creation texts actually say, when they were written, and how much deep time they can honestly preserve. Before the first king, there was water. That is the image repeated across many Egyptian accounts of creation, an immeasurable darkness without separated sky or earth, without fields, cities, temples, or human generations. Egyptians later called this primordial condition none. From it, the ordered world emerged. Yet none was not a historical flood that drowned an earlier Egyptian kingdom. It was what existed before existence had taken recognizable form. The distinction is easy to lose because the imagery feels geological. Water covers everything. Land rises from it. A creator appears upon the first dry place. Life begins after the waters retreat. Seen through modern expectations, the story seems to preserve the aftermath of a catastrophe. But Egyptian creation traditions were not eyewitness reports transmitted unchanged from the early Holocene. They were theological explanations of why an ordered world could arise from formlessness, and why that world remained vulnerable to disorder. No single Egyptian text presents one complete creation narrative accepted everywhere and unchanged through time. Ideas appeared in royal funerary texts, temple inscriptions, hymns, ritual compositions, coffins, papyri, and later theological works. Different religious centers emphasized different creator gods and different sequences of emergence. These traditions could compete, overlap, or be combined without requiring one version to eliminate all the others. At Hierakonpolis, the creator was expressed through Atum and closely connected solar forms. Atum came into being within the primordial waters and generated the first divine pair, Shu and Tefnut. From them came Geb and Nut, earth and sky, followed by Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. The genealogy transformed the structure of the universe into a divine family. Space, air, moisture, earth, sky, kingship, fertility, death, and conflict were connected through relationships among gods. The first mound rising from Nun became an especially powerful symbol. Later tradition associated it with the Ben at Hierakonpolis. Its emergence resembled the appearance of high ground when floodwater withdrew, and it may have drawn imaginative force from the Nile landscape. But symbolic resemblance does not prove that the mound represented the ruins of a prehistoric city, exposed after one enormous flood. The first land was a sacred beginning, not an excavated continent. At Hermopolis, creation could be imagined through a group of 8 primordial deities, the Ogdoad. They represented qualities associated with the world before order darkness, hiddenness, limitlessness, and the watery deep. Male members were often depicted with frog heads and female members with serpent heads, forms connected with creatures emerging from wet environments. From their interaction came the conditions in which the sun and ordered creation could appear. Later versions describe the sun emerging from a lotus or cosmic egg. These images varied according to period and context. They should not be forced into one standardized sequence, as if Egyptian priests had maintained a single secret historical doctrine. The variety is the point. Creation could be approached from several directions because it remained larger than any one description. At Memphis, Ptah became the supreme creative intelligence in the composition preserved on the Shabaka stone. Creation was accomplished through the heart and tongue, through conception and authoritative speech. Ptah imagined the world and brought it into ordered existence by naming it. The stone's inscription says that King Shabaka had the text copied from an older, damaged document, but scholars debate the date and development of the underlying composition. The claim of antiquity cannot simply be accepted as proof that the full surviving theology existed before the dynasties. The Memphite account reveals how religious centers could absorb other traditions rather than destroy them. Ptah did not need to erase Atum. He could be presented as the power through which Atum and the other gods came into existence. Egyptian theology often expanded by identification and combination. One god could be joined with another, given a new epithet, or described as the hidden source behind a familiar creator. This flexibility makes the search for one original Egyptian flood story particularly hazardous. A sentence preserved in a late temple may contain very ancient ideas, recent interpretation, or both. Priests living under Ptolemaic or Roman rule could describe ceremonies as descending from the age of the gods. That description established sacred authority. It did not provide archaeological dating. The expression often rendered as the first occasion referred to the primordial moment when creation and divine order were established. Temples could recreate that beginning within their architecture and rituals. A sanctuary became a mound surrounded symbolically by the waters of chaos. Columns resembled papyrus and lotus plants. Sacred lakes represented primeval water, the daily awakening, clothing, feeding, and concealment of a divine image renewed the ordered relationship between gods, king, temple, and land. The first occasion was therefore not simply a remote year on a chronological line. It was a sacred condition capable of being renewed. Each sunrise repeated the victory of light. Each successful inundation renewed fertility. Each royal accession restored legitimate order. Each temple ritual pushed back the possibility that creation might collapse into darkness and silence. Nunad never entirely disappeared. The primordial waters remained beyond and beneath the created world, a source of life but also a reminder of instability. The sun god travelled through darkness each night and returned at dawn. The dead entered a hidden realm in hope of renewal. Order was not won once and guaranteed forever. It required repetition, protection, speech, offering, and correct ritual action. This recurring struggle was expressed through Mat and Isfet. Mat included order, justice, proper relationship, and cosmic balance. Isfet included falsehood, violence, disorder, and destructive disruption. Pharaohs presented themselves as defenders of Maat, but that claim was ideological rather than a description of an Egypt without hardship. Drought, excessive floods, hunger, rebellion, foreign invasion, disease, and dynastic conflict continued. Royal imagery placed these dangers outside the ideal order, even when they existed within Egyptian society. A later and more violent myth comes from the composition known as the Book of the Heavenly Cow. Humanity rebels against the aged sun god Ra, who sends his destructive eye identified with Hathor in her violent form to attack the rebels. Slaughter continues until Ra prevents complete annihilation, by flooding the land with beer dyed red. The goddess drinks what appears to be blood, becomes intoxicated, and humanity survives. Ra then withdraws into the sky, and the structure of the cosmos is reorganized. The story contains divine anger, near destruction, red liquid covering the ground, survivors, and a transformed world. It can therefore sound like a variation of a flood narrative when summarized loosely. But the destroying force is not a deluge. No righteous family builds an ark. No boat preserves animals from world-covering water. The liquid that ends the killing is beer used to deceive the goddess, not flood water sent to erase civilization. The surviving versions of the composition come from the New Kingdom, including royal funerary contexts associated with Tutankhamun, Seti Theoskiemt, Rameses II, Rameses III, and Rameses VI. Elements of the story may be older, but its preserved form belongs to a literate religious world many centuries after the emergence of the Egyptian state. It cannot be read as a direct testimony from people who survived early Holocene Nile floods. Egyptian traditions did remember periods before ordinary human kingship. Gods ruled, followed in some lists by semi-divine beings or followers of Horus. Later writers compressed and rearranged these sacred sequences in different ways. The reigns could extend across impossible lengths because their purpose was not to reproduce archaeological time. They placed the crown inside a cosmic succession reaching beyond human history. To turn those divine reigns into a technologically advanced dynasty requires archaeology that has not appeared. Mythic rulers do not supply cities, workshops, burials, tools, food remains, or inscriptions from the dates assigned to them. A sacred genealogy is evidence for how Egyptians understood kingship, not proof that historians have misplaced an entire civilization. Yet the myths still preserve something real. They preserve the emotional geography of a society dependent upon water. They preserve the sight of land emerging from inundation, the terror of boundaries dissolving, the daily return of sunlight, and the knowledge that abundance could become destruction when natural balance failed. They preserve the political hope that someone could stand between uncertainty and order. The pharaohs used that hope. By identifying royal rule with the maintenance of creation, they made political obedience part of cosmic survival. Rebellion became more than resistance to taxation or authority. It could be presented as an alliance with chaos. A successful king renewed the first occasion. A temple foundation repeated the emergence of land. A defeated enemy was shown falling outside the world protected by Met. This was another form of burial. The conflicts that created the Egyptian state were covered by a sacred story in which kingship had existed since the beginning of order. Regional traditions were joined to royal theology. Environmental experience became cosmic symbolism. The difficult work of farmers, herders, fishers, craftspeople, and migrants disappeared behind the timeless image of a ruler maintaining creation. But the burial was never complete. Beneath divine genealogy remained settlements, cemeteries, pottery traditions, animal bones, grains, hearths, labels, boats, and altered landscapes. They reveal no single civilization destroyed in one flood. They reveal something harder to reduce to legend: many communities living through environmental instability and gradually building the systems later claimed by kings. The final question is therefore not whether Egypt had a past before the pharaohs. It unquestionably did. The question is why that long human past is repeatedly transformed into a lost empire, and why the fantasy of one buried civilization can seem more satisfying than the fragmented evidence of thousands of lives. To answer that, we must return one last time to the ruins, the missing names, and the silence that monuments create around everything standing beneath them. Silence invites invention. When a monument survives without the voices of most people who built it, the empty space around that monument begins to fill with stories. Some stories imagine refugees arriving after a global flood. Others describe pre-scientists preserving knowledge from a forgotten age. A few claim that the pharaohs deliberately concealed the ruins of an older and more advanced civilization beneath temples, tombs, and pyramids. These ideas endure because they turn fragmentary evidence into a complete drama: destruction, survival, secrecy, and rediscovery. Archaeology offers a less complete story, but a more extraordinary one. Before the pharaohs, there was no empty Egypt waiting for civilization to arrive. There were communities living beside lakes, seasonal rivers, marshes, desert pastures, delta channels, and the Nile. They hunted, fished, gathered plants, cultivated crops, managed animals, exchanged materials, buried their dead, marked sacred places, and responded to environmental change. Their worlds were neither primitive rehearsals for dynastic Egypt nor fragments of one lost empire. They were societies with their own histories. Some disappeared when water sources failed, others moved closer to the Nile as North Africa became more arid. Communities met, exchanged practices, competed for territory, and absorbed one another. Settlements grew. Craft production became more specialized. Regional elites accumulated goods and authority. Symbols of power became standardized. Boats connected distant places. Administrative marks appeared on containers and labels. Warfare and alliance helped larger political units emerge. No single moment transformed this varied landscape into Egypt. Even political unification was a process rather than one clean act performed by one ruler. Narmer's monuments presented domination as a completed victory because royal images were designed to eliminate uncertainty. They did not show every negotiation, local resistance, failed alliance, marriage, journey, harvest, or generation of conflict that made the new kingdom possible. The image of unity was itself one of the technologies through which unity was created. The pharaohs buried that complicated past beneath a simpler history. They placed the king at the center of time. Royal lists arranged selected rulers into legitimate succession while omitting inconvenient reigns, rival dynasties, and periods that disrupted the preferred order. Temples described kingship as an institution established by the gods. Rituals repeatedly returned the world to the first occasion, when land emerged from water and divine authority organized creation. This did not require a secret council deciding to erase prehistory. Burial occurred through the ordinary operation of power. Kings commissioned monuments to kings. Scribes recorded taxation, offerings, victories, estates, and royal anniversaries. Temples preserved traditions that supported their sacred authority. Perishable records disappeared, while inscriptions cut into stone survived. The people most able to shape memory were those who controlled durable materials and institutions. The environment performed another burial. Delta mud covered settlements beneath later floods and towns. River channels migrated, lakes contracted. Desert winds exposed some sites and concealed others. Mud brick walls dissolved into the soil from which they had been made. Wooden structures rotted. Reed shelters vanished almost completely. Graves were robbed, workshops dismantled, and old stone reused in new buildings. What remains is not a balanced archive of the past. It is a damaged selection produced by geology, climate, human choice, and chance. Monuments distort that selection further. A pyramid can survive for more than 4,000 years, while the houses of the people who supplied its builders may disappear within generations. A stone ceremonial pallet enters a museum, while countless baskets, ropes, garments, meals, songs, and conversations leave little trace. The survivors' record therefore makes early Egypt appear to be a civilization of kings and tombs. In life, it was overwhelmingly a civilization of farmers, boat crews, herders, potters, quarry workers, brewers, bakers, scribes, servants, healers, craftspeople, and families. These are the people the pharaohs buried most completely. Their grain supported royal estates. Their animals supplied meat for workers and offerings for gods. Their taxes became stone, timber, copper, cloth, and labour. Their seasonal obligations allowed construction to continue. Their local knowledge guided boats through changing channels and taught farmers when water, soil, and seed might cooperate. Yet the completed monument transformed their accumulated work into the eternal achievement of one ruler. To say this is not to deny the creativity or religious conviction of the builders. Royal projects could create community, status, employment, pride, devotion, and opportunity as well as hardship and compulsion. Ancient motives do not fit comfortably into modern categories. A person could believe in the sacred necessity of a monument while resenting the official who demanded supplies for it. A skilled mason could serve the crown with pride and still suffer injury, separation, or exhaustion. Human societies rarely build their greatest works from one emotion. Nor does this history remove every mystery. Archaeologists have not found every settlement, identified every ruler, or reconstructed every construction method. Dates continue to be revised. New excavations may reveal unsuspected connections among the Sahara, Nile Valley, Delta, Red Sea, Levant, and regions farther south. Remote sensing, sediment cores, residue analysis, ancient DNA, and improved dating may transform parts of the story. But an unanswered question is not evidence for any answer we choose. A lost advanced civilization would require positive traces, securely dated settlements, production areas, tools, waste, food remains, burials, transport systems, trade networks, and a technological sequence belonging to that society. Great knowledge does not survive only as a finished pyramid while leaving no quarries, workshops, experiments, repairs, or communities behind. Technology is not an isolated secret. It is a system of materials, skills, instruction, labour, failure, maintenance, and reproduction. Egypt preserves precisely such a system. Long before Giza, people shaped stone, built tombs, made vessels, transported goods, measured space, and organized ritual landscapes. At Saqqara, the step pyramid translated older materials into limestone. At Merimde and Dahshur, builders revised plans and confronted structural problems. The bent pyramid changed angle while rising. The red pyramid applied a more stable solution. At Giza, local quarries transported casing stone, crew marks, settlements, cemeteries, waterways, and Mera's journal connect the Great Pyramid to the state that constructed it. This sequence contains gaps, but it does not contain a technological impossibility. Its incompleteness is what we should expect from deep history. The deeper we travel, the fewer voices remain, and the more cautiously evidence must be joined. Archaeology does not restore the past as a continuous film. It reconstructs probabilities from broken pottery, disturbed graves, microscopic residues, ruined walls, environmental records, and objects whose original meanings may never be fully recovered. The flood story becomes more compelling when released from the demand that it describe one global catastrophe. Water shaped Egyptian life at every scale. Ancient communities experienced dangerous floods, changing channels, expanding wetlands, and the long disappearance of greener Saharan landscapes. The annual inundation brought fertility while threatening destruction. Creation theology transformed this experience into the image of land rising from none. Temples renewed that emergence, and kings claimed to hold the boundary between order and chaos. What survived was not a scientific report from flood refugees. It was a religious language built around dependence, uncertainty, and return. The Nile rose. The land vanished beneath water. The land returned. Seeds entered dark soil and became life. The sun disappeared each evening and reappeared at dawn. The dead entered hidden chambers in hope that another form of emergence remained possible. Egyptian civilization did not need one prehistoric deluge to become fascinated with renewal. Renewal surrounded it. Perhaps this is why the idea of a civilization before the pharaohs feels so difficult to abandon. It recognizes, correctly, that dynastic Egypt had a deep past. It senses that monuments conceal as much as they reveal. It understands that water transformed landscapes and that official history excluded countless lives. The error comes when these true intuitions are forced into one spectacular conclusion. There was a world before the pharaohs, but it was not one world. There were many communities, many environments, and many paths toward greater social complexity. There were forgotten leaders, vanished settlements, local gods, migrations, conflicts, droughts, floods, discoveries, and failures. Some developments may never be recovered. Others wait beneath fields, towns, desert sand, or delta sediment. Their invisibility does not make them citizens of an advanced empire. It makes them inhabitants of a past whose preservation was uneven. In the end, what the pharaohs buried was more human than a forbidden technology. They buried the stages through which authority became sacred. They buried regional histories beneath the image of the two lands. They buried collective labor beneath royal names. They buried temporary buildings inside permanent stone, earlier objects inside later monuments, and political conflict inside stories of cosmic order. Above all, they buried the slow development of Egypt beneath the appearance that Egypt had always existed. Now the desert grows quiet around the monuments. The casing stones that once reflected sunlight are mostly gone. Temples have collapsed into foundations. Harbours have dried or shifted away. Workers' voices no longer move through the streets beside the plateau. The Nile continues beyond the darkness, following a course that is ancient but never entirely unchanged. The pyramids remain, but they no longer stand alone. Behind them are the experiments of Merimde and Dahshur. Behind those are Saqqara and Abydos. Farther back are Hierakonpolis, Nakkada, Maadi, Merimde, Nabta Playa, and places whose names have vanished. Beyond them are shorelines around vanished lakes, hearths exposed briefly to the wind, and footsteps made before anyone could have imagined a pharaoh. There is no need to place a lost empire in that darkness. The darkness is already filled with people watching water rise, carrying vessels between settlements, guiding animals toward pasture, shaping stone beside a fire, placing food near the dead, and learning which parts of the changing landscape could sustain another generation. Their civilization was not buried in one day. It accumulated slowly, disappeared unevenly, and survived inside the Egypt that followed. If we listen beyond the royal names and look beneath the monumental stone, the silence begins to change. It does not reveal one forbidden answer. It reveals thousands of unfinished human stories resting beneath the world the pharaohs made eternal.